What do you strongly suspect but have no proof of?
That my English teacher didn't read essays and based grades on how we were in class.
I know this for a fact about my freshman English teacher. I put, "Are you reading this?" in the middle of a paper. She did not mark it or ever comment on it.
Once, in a science lab report I put, "Include later," intending to come back and finish that section last. I forgot to. When I got it back graded, the teacher had circled it and written, "How much later?"
Had a teacher who told us once when he was at college, he thought his English professor was doing the same thing. He would turn in a paper and just get a grade back, no other marks or notes. So he decided to randomly insert, "If you read this, I owe you 1 case of beer." Got the paper back as usual, with a grade, nothing else. So he kept doing this for all his papers. End of the year comes along, everyone gets their final grades, except for my teacher. The professor then states to the class that he owes him 20 cases of beer before he gets his grade. Turns out he had been reading them all and made extensive notes separately. He had to borrow his buddy's truck to get the professor's favorite beer in order to pass the class.
It depends on where your essay falls in the pile. The first few are always read very thoroughly, the last 5 end up being me with 3 glasses of wine and you get an A. Everyone gets an A. Seriously though, after reading 15 papers on the same damn topic you get bored and annoyed. I used to be an adjunct professor at a college and got stuck grading 60+ end-of-term papers that were each 8 pages long. I drank so much wine that semester.
My late professor in undergrad would be rather colorful in his comments depending on where our essays fell in the stack. Read how much wine he'd gone through. My favorite comment was on a classmate's, "You're like Johnny Comma Seed, throwing commas around like you're trying to grow freaking comma trees."
Dentists ask you questions with all that stuff in your mouth because they think it's funny to watch you struggle.
Wife is a dental assistant. I asked her this. She says it's to distract the patient to make them feel it didn't take as long as it really did.
Nah, mostly because it is incredibly boring to do the same thing over and over in complete silence for years on end. Getting to know your patients is much more rewarding and makes the task less tedious for everyone involved. Source: my dad is a dentist.
Some zoos have empty exhibits and just claim the animal isn't there, you just never see them.
This. I've gone to the same zoo once a year for the past 10 years, and not once have I seen the wombat there.
Somewhat unrelated. I was just thinking how cool a nocturnal zoo would be. Only open at night, and they specialize in species that only are awake at night. That'd be sweet. Probably no business but cool nonetheless.
Check out Singapore's night safari.
That only about 20% of people actually do any work. The rest just get by looking busy.
I'd say 80% of people work just 20% of their work hours.
This is an actual problem that large corporations face. It is known as Price's Law, which states that the square root of the number of people in a domain do 50% of the work. So with 10 workers, 3 do 50% of the work, which is acceptable. But a larger company of 100 workers only 10 do 50% of the work, and so on and so forth. When you think about it, it seems absurd but true in the same time.
Anyone who's done group projects already knows this is true. Sometimes other people actually do want to contribute, but they're just not competent or efficient enough.
I genuinely love to know how much of the day my coworkers spend actually working. I have no doubt I'm on the low end of that spectrum, but I'm curious what the top end is like. Some people look like they're focused for the full 8 hours, and that's just unbelievable to me.
I used to be a part of that 20% until I realized the 80% were getting promotions before I was. This job.
Historians plus 200 years from now will be able to look at all of the private messages and data of people who have been long dead. Similar to how we can read private letters of people from 1700s.
The issue is that digital records are by no means permanent.
Sure. But I'd be amazed if Google, Apple, FB, etc. don't have extensive data on me and every other user. Messages, photos, videos, links. Everyone I know who works at these places know that it's all sitting on a server somewhere.
Will it even make any sense? Half of what we say are emoji, and the other half this week's memes. The context for understanding is shorter and shorter, and much of the future's ability to understand the nuance of those messages will be lost. According to my research, the exchanging of eggplants was very important to the people of 2019.
The newly digitized male hominids rather enjoyed sending images of their reproductive organ, thinking it would attract potential mates. In many cases it had the opposite effect.
That my abusive stepfather went to jail, not exile, for 8 years when I was a teen, and that for a few years prior we were actually running from the law, not hiding from the government because of his activism. This suddenly dawned on me about a month ago, more than a decade later. Kind of like how it suddenly clicks that the dog didn't go to a farm.
I'm 42. I realized this summer that my dad is an alcoholic. He's been stumbling around drunk for 42 years, and I realized it this year. Kids are funny about that stuff.
First time I went to a party in high school I was like, hey, this stuff smells like my parents' room, oh.
Cornhole is a conspiracy by the insurance industry because they feel horseshoes is too dangerous.
This is the kind of low-stakes conspiracy I could get into.
I think it's just a conspiracy to make people say cornhole.
That Bath and Body Works has like 13 unique scents. Every couple of months they just rotate the scents in and call them something else.
I read something similar to this by a Yankee Candle outlet employee. Most of the scents are identical, but the names get licensed, so they need to be changed from what's in the actual chain stores, and half the time in those main stores the new seasonal scent has just been renamed from last season.
This actually happens. Source used to do data entry for retail SKUs. Soap, candle, and other fragrance companies change names but use the same scent codes. They might retire for a couple seasons, but if they sold worth a damn they'll be back.
I worked for the most of my college years and can basically confirm this. They have their core collection and their seasonal collection. Their seasonal is the same base scents with a little bit of a change. Add vanilla, take away some flower. Their candle scents are almost always recycled with different names. Also, fun fact, you can return or exchange any product at any point and they technically cannot deny it.
That the ginger ale at this diner I go to every day is just Coke and Sprite mixed together.
It is actually not unheard of for ginger ale to be swapped out for the Coke Sprite combo. They're just counting on you not noticing. Source: used to work in the service industry.
What? How could you not notice that? I feel like I'd notice every time. But maybe I've already been fooled.
That my grandmother had a child before she married my grandfather. When my grandparents met and started dating, my grandma was only 13. My grandpa was 20. They married when she was 17 and he was 24, right after he came back from serving in World War II. That was about as much of the story as anyone in my family ever knew. They'd been dating, then he went overseas, and she wrote to him while he was gone. When he got back, they got married. A few years after my grandma died, my grandfather suddenly mentioned that they'd actually been broken up for a while before she started writing to him. After they'd dated about a year, he went to pick her up at her house one day, only to find she wasn't home. Her parents informed him that she'd left to live with some cousins a few hours away, and she'd be gone for about a year. He got upset that she hadn't told him about this in advance and ended the relationship. When another yearish had passed and she returned home to her parents, she started writing him overseas and apologized, and they started dating again. My grandpa told this story very blandly and seemed to believe that the situation was what it said on the tin, but of course in the 1940s to 60s it was quite common for teenage girls to go live with relatives for a year, as a code for having an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. My grandpa would never have admitted if they'd been having sex, but I'm betting they were. She got pregnant, and she was sent off somewhere to have the baby. I've done commercial DNA testing, so I'm on the lookout for someone to turn up as a sibling match to my mom someday. The only other explanation for my grandma suddenly leaving town would be if her parents didn't approve her relationship with my grandpa, but from everything I know of them they were perfectly fine with their 13-year-old daughter dating a guy in his 20s.
Go live with relatives for a year. My mom's ex-mother-in-law, yeah, had a sort of similar story. We were chatting last Christmas, and my girlfriend mentioned her dad had a cabin at this super remote lake, and the email says something about, oh, that area was wonderful. I spent a year at a ranch up there when I was younger. And then got this weird look on her face and never ever mentioned it again. I'm not blood related to them, But I know that that side of the family has had several incidents in almost every generation. The ex-brother-in-law just found out at the age of about 60 that he has a 30-year-old daughter with some lady he hooked up with while camping one night. But I also know that my grandfather on that side wasn't my biological grandfather. Parents let me know in my mid-22s, long after he had passed. My biological grandfather died in World War II and my grandmother remarried. I feel like there's a lot of stories like that where the family just quietly created a new truth for the sake of propriety.
When my grandparents met and started dating, my grandma was only 13. My grandpa was 20. Phew.
Totally normal back then. My kind of adopted grandparents, Horace and Mill, nicknamed for Mildred, were 19 and 13 when they married. Millie told me about how the day after they married, she went to her mother's house and said, "Mama, he's mean." Her mother said, "You made your bed, now sleep in it." They went on to be married for 68 years, mostly happily, after the first 4 or so, until Millie's death. Horace lived for another 8 years.
Horace and Millie are two of the oldest old person names I can imagine.
Reddit questions are a clever way I could compile data on every one of us. It's taking questions like, what would you buy if you could only buy things with the first letter of your name? Children of the 80s what? What is it in your state country that? It's capable of building a profile on all of us.
I believe my grandmother was a serial killer. She was married 7 times, each ending in a sudden death. She died in the 1980s, but everything is still suspicious, and no one seems to know anything. I did find an article about her when she came to the US where her first husband died defending her after her ex-boyfriend climbed in her window in New York City. I also found evidence of her having been in prison before coming to the US.
This makes me appreciate my grandma.